For decades, Russia's dictators stood before their people and condemned capitalism as the enemy of the worker. They mocked it, ridiculed it, and framed it as the poison that would destroy society. But behind closed doors, in dimly lit rooms where no ordinary citizen would ever be allowed to enter, they quietly built their own invisible empire, an empire so vast and so secretive that it moved Stalin's gold across the heart of London without anyone noticing. And that same shadowy empire, born in the ashes of war and fueled by paranoia, still hides billions today for Vladimir Putin. The machinery behind all of this came from the unlikeliest places: Western banks, Western markets, and Western financial elites who publicly denounced communism while privately keeping it alive. This is the story of how Russia's greatest enemies became its most loyal lifeline. It begins in the summer of 1941, when Nazi Germany hurled 3 million soldiers, 3,000 tanks, and 2,500 warplanes into the Soviet Union. Operation Barbarossa, the largest land invasion in human history, hit the USSR like a hammer. The Red Army collapsed almost instantly. Entire divisions evaporated in days. Tens of thousands were killed or captured. And while the front burned, Stalin froze. His own generals had warned him repeatedly about the likelihood of a German attack, but he dismissed them. He convinced himself that Hitler would never dare strike. And when Hitler did, Stalin locked himself inside his office, silent, stunned, unable to give orders. For days, the Soviet Union drifted leaderless while German tanks thundered toward Moscow. But Stalin's paralysis was only the surface of a deeper disaster. 4 years before the invasion, during the Great Terror, he had willingly dismantled his own military. Terrified of rivals within the Communist Party, he unleashed a purge that swallowed civilians, politicians, and nearly the entire senior officer corps. Generals were executed, commanders imprisoned, and decision-making was poisoned by fear. Officers feared Stalin more than they feared the Germans. As a result, when war came, the command structure was hollow and terrified. The country bled because its leader had destroyed the very people who could have saved it. Yet even with its crippled leadership, the Soviet Union eventually dug in, stopped the German advance, and began the long push toward victory. The triumph would come at a cost almost too large to comprehend. Over 1,700 cities and towns destroyed. 70,000 villages burned. 25 million people displaced. 6 million buildings reduced to dust. 30,000 factories gone. More than 100,000 schools, clinics, and hospitals erased. Economists estimate the damage at the equivalent of nearly $4 trillion today. And while the Germans were responsible for much of that destruction, a significant part came from Stalin himself. As the Red Army retreated, he ordered entire towns burned, bridges blown, factories destroyed, and regions scorched so the Germans would inherit nothing but ash. His own soldiers set fire to their homeland. But while the country burned, Stalin grew stronger. The chaos allowed him to tighten his grip, and from the ruins he rebuilt a new Soviet empire, one that served his interests alone. Soviet forces stripped the territories they conquered. They took livestock, machinery, artwork, rail cars, entire factories. They dismantled industrial plants across Eastern Europe and shipped them east. And from the West, he squeezed even more. The United States had launched Lend-Lease, offering weapons, fuel, food, and machinery to allies with no demand for immediate repayment. Stalin accepted everything. After the war, he simply refused to return most of it. In total, he gained what economists estimate as the equivalent of nearly $11 trillion today. With this surplus of wealth, Stalin quietly built one of the world's largest gold reserves. He expanded mines using prisoners of war as forced labor. Men worked to exhaustion and death so the regime could accumulate more gold to trade abroad. But Stalin had a problem. He needed Western markets, Western machinery, and Western money, yet he could never admit to his people that the Soviet Empire relied entirely on the capitalist world he claimed to despise. So he created a secret financial shadow network. It started with 3 quiet banks: Moscow Narodny Bank in London, Eurobank in Paris, and Bank Russo-Iran in Tehran. To the outside world, they looked like ordinary institutions. In reality, they were pipelines. They moved Stalin's gold across borders, hid money in foreign accounts, bought Western technology, and built shell companies to conceal every transaction. Western bankers played along because the Soviets had one thing everyone trusted: gold. The USSR held the largest gold reserves on Earth outside of Fort Knox. Western financiers loved that. Politics meant nothing when profit was guaranteed. Through this offshore web, Stalin bought what his country could not produce. He purchased machinery, secured critical materials, and kept the regime alive not through communist economics, but through capitalism done in the shadows. This system survived long after Stalin died. The Communist Party continued denouncing capitalism for the public while privately expanding their offshore empire. By 1975, they had tripled their banking presence in the West. Soviet-controlled banks in London and Paris held billions in assets, quietly moving even more behind the scenes. They raised billions in syndicated loans and funneled money to Eastern Europe, Cuba, Yugoslavia, all outside the view of their citizens. These banks weren't just pipelines. They were intelligence tools. Western institutions unknowingly fed them commercial secrets, market data, global pricing patterns, and credit profiles. The Soviets used this information to decide who could be pressured, who could be bought, and who could be trusted. Western governments even offered generous credit lines to the Soviet bloc, ignoring politics for profit. Some Western banks even invested inside the USSR itself. But in Washington, concerns grew. Declassified CIA reports warned that Western loans, channeled through these Soviet banks, were funding the Soviet military. The West was unknowingly bankrolling the arsenal aimed at them. When the Soviet Union collapsed in 1991, you'd expect the system to disappear. It didn't. It simply changed shape. The Communist Party elites rebranded themselves as businessmen. Their wealth didn't vanish, it migrated. It moved offshore, into shell companies, into foreign banks. The West helped accelerate this transformation. The IMF, U.S. policymakers, and Wall Street economists pushed Russia into an economic experiment called shock therapy. The plan was to electrify Russia's economy, remove controls, privatize industries, and unleash market forces. In practice, it became the greatest transfer of public wealth into private hands ever recorded. The Russian government issued 148 million vouchers to ordinary citizens, each representing a share of formerly state-owned companies. But most people were desperate for food and medicine. They sold their vouchers for almost nothing. The former Soviet banking class bought millions of them cheaply. Factories, oil fields, mines, TV stations, all were scooped up by a small group of connected insiders. Western banks helped move and hide the money offshore. Russia's economy collapsed. Ordinary people fell into poverty. And a new class of super-rich oligarchs rose from the chaos. But the elites wanted even more. They devised a second scheme, loans for shares. A handful of billionaires lent money to President Boris Yeltsin's government. In return, they gained temporary control of Russia's most valuable companies. When the government defaulted, as the oligarchs expected, they kept everything: oil giants, metal empires, banks. Russia's jewels were sold for almost nothing to men who had once been members of the Soviet elite. Democracy looked like it was failing, but in reality, the same people were still in charge, just operating with new tools. By 1999, Things were collapsing. The economy was falling apart. Yeltsin's popularity was gone. His inner circle needed protection. They needed someone loyal, someone quiet, someone controllable, someone who would protect their wealth. They chose a little-known former KGB officer from St. Petersburg. They thought he would be timid. They thought he would be grateful. They thought he would obey. They were wrong. Vladimir Putin took the presidency, and within months, he turned the system on its head. He used his intelligence background to identify where the oligarchs hid their money, who owed favors, and who could be threatened. Those who resisted him were exiled, imprisoned, or killed. Those who submitted became his loyalists. Putin didn't build a new empire. He hijacked the old one. The gold networks, the shell companies, the offshore banks, everything Stalin created, everything the communist elite expanded, everything the oligarchs abused, Putin now controlled. Today, many believe Putin's personal wealth reaches $200 billion. His possessions, the palaces, yachts, jets, rarely appear under his own name. They're hidden under layers of shell companies in jurisdictions designed for secrecy. His network functions exactly like Stalin's: reward loyalty, eliminate threats, and move money quietly through Western systems that claim to oppose him. And when Russia invaded Ukraine in 2022, the world saw this network flex its muscle. Western leaders promised punishments, sanctions, asset freezes, economic warfare. Yet years later, the money largely remains intact. The ruble never collapsed. Western banks struggled to leave Russia. Some didn't bother trying. Putin had already passed laws allowing his allies to seize foreign businesses the moment they tried to exit. Sanctions hit ordinary Russians harder than they hit Putin's elite. And crucially, the West never targeted the secret financial pipelines built decades earlier. These networks remained untouched. Today, Western banks quietly lobby against even mild proposals to use profits from frozen Russian assets to support Ukraine. They speak about legal risks, about stability, about financial norms. But the truth is simpler: they're entangled in Putin's empire. Too entangled to fully break away. When you look back, from Stalin to Putin, through wars, collapses, and revolutions, one truth becomes clear. The real power behind Russia's strongmen was never ideology. It wasn't communism or nationalism. It wasn't tanks or nuclear missiles. It was money. Control the money, and you control the elites. Control the elites, and you control the state. This is why powerful nations tread carefully around men like Putin, or China's Xi Jinping, or Saudi Arabia's Crown Prince. It's not diplomacy. It's not caution. It's finance. If you made it all the way to the end, leave an upside-down smiley emoji in the comments so I know you stayed with me through the entire journey. Make sure to subscribe if you haven't already, and leave a like if you enjoyed this story. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next video.